So I was going to talk about this as part of compliance, but I ended up forgetting. So we're going to do a little short segment on obedience, which is part of compliance. So obedience really focuses on acting in direct response to orders or requests from a perceived authority figure. And we will be using the Milgram experiment to illustrate how the principle of authority comes into play here. So the Milgram experiment aimed to look at how regular civilians could commit atrocities like those committed in the Holocaust. So mainly looking at the Nazi group and how the regime really allowed people to behave that way, whether it was innate human nature or there was something more there. So the Milgram experiment utilized a room with a computer setup and a scientist. So they invited participants to come in, sit down at the computer, and there was a control board in front of them, which if they pressed, it would administer electric shocks. And they believed that in the opposite room, there was another participant who was an actor, and they would be receiving these electric shocks. So for every round that they were given a piece of paper with questions on them, and if the other participant answered wrong, they would have to administer an electric shock, and the scientist would be watching the whole time. So in this situation, right, the researcher slash the scientist is the authoritarian figure, although in this experiment, it's not directly put into question any consequences they would face for not completing the experiment. So as they escalated, the electric shock became to a point where it became lethal, and some participants really did find moral conflict and chose to walk out of the room believing that they had in fact seriously injured someone. But I think they found about 60% of total participants went up to that lethal shock level just because they were in this compliant situation and they were taking orders from an authoritarian figure, even if it didn't go along with their own moral compass. They just followed the orders they were given. So what they did was, for every time the participant wanted to stop, the experimenter would repeat a certain script, and it was always along the lines of, the experiment requires to keep going, or it was just, everything was very objective. They didn't mention anything about what was happening in the other room. If they asked whether the participant was okay, they just say that the experiment had to keep going, and they wanted to see how many people would really go along with this, even if they knew that they were hurting someone. And the result is really just that human nature is pretty fickle, and we tend to do things just even if we have a fear of authority, because they perceived the scientists and the whole experiment as something they had committed to and that they had to do because they had already agreed to do it. So they just kept going without hesitation, even if it meant they were maybe killing someone else. Yeah, so that's the principle of authority, illustrated in quite a violent way, but it does do very powerful things in explaining how humans can behave in horrible ways without it being their original intent. We kind of just go along with what other people say based on our own fears.